Well, what is up, everybody? Thanks for clicking on my channel. Well, you saw the title of this video, you saw the thumbnail, you know exactly what we're doing. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite bands, Dream Theater, and ranking every single one of their studio albums. A change of season notwithstanding, apparently. I know that was an EP, so I guess it's not on this list. But yeah, Dream Theater is one of my all-time favorite bands. I think for any metal musician, especially someone who's more on the progressive rock or progressive metal side, I mean, they are just one of the ultimate bands. The thing that's going to be interesting about ranking all their albums, though, is that, at least for me, I feel like they have very few albums in which every single song is a banger. More often than not, I find myself listening to a Dream Theater album, and about five or six of the songs are really good, amazing. And then there's usually always like two or three that I just don't like as much as the rest. Not always. There's a couple albums, and I'll definitely go into them, that I think just every song is an absolute banger from beginning to end. The album is just incredible. Um, and so since we're ranking them, I'm going to try to hold my feet to the fire and not just put every single album up in the S tier. But with that being said, also, I don't like to rag on musicians, especially with my favorite band, so I'm not going to be being overly critical of their albums. I will give my opinion, but let's be honest, every single one of these albums has incredible musicianship on it, and even the worst of these albums took about 150,000 times more effort than it does to sit here and talk about it. So, I'm not going to be giving them too hard of a time. And with that being said, I'm sure you might disagree with some of the things I say here, so if you have a different opinion, please, let me know what your favorite Dream Theater albums are. And once again, by the ranking S tier all the way down to C minus and this is in comparison to other Dream Theater albums. So even the ones down here, I'd probably still take listening to over, a lot of other bands and musicians. But with all that being said, all that out of the way, we'll get right into it. And if you like talking about music and hard rock, heavy metal, progressive rock, all this stuff, please join my channel, subscribe, do all that stuff. And with that out of the way, let's just kind of sit back, relax, and enjoy ourselves and talk about some Dream Theater. Coming in with their first album, When Dream and Day Unite, from 1989. The only album that does not have James LaBrie on vocals. The singer was Charlie Damamici, if I'm saying that correct. The only Dream Theater album released in the 80s, and quite frankly, the only Dream Theater album that doesn't really sound like Dream Theater. I'm going to put this down in bottom tier. And I think that's sort of probably the consensus among most fans of Dream Theater. I think that probably is the consensus among the members of Dream Theater themselves. I bet if you ask Mike Portnoy or John Petrucci or John Mayung what they thought of this album, they'd probably be like, that's our first attempt, and we've grown a lot since then. I mean, the musicianship is incredible on this album, but the production is very tinny. This is the only Dream Theater album that sounds like it belongs in the 1980s. If I didn't know this was Dream Theater and I listened to this, I would actually kind of like it. Honestly, maybe it'd be up in S tier, because it reminds me a lot of kind of bands like Watchtower, Fate's Warning, these bands in the 1980s that were a bit more obscure and a bit more underground, where you kind of hear one of their albums and you're like, oh, this is really cool, and then they never did much after that. I mean, Fate's Warning had a career, but like for Watchtower, for example, they only had one album, if I'm not mistaken. So it's just so niche, and as a fan of music and as someone who loves obscure 1980s heavy metal, I do appreciate it for that. But if we're being honest here, it still sounds like it's in the shadow of its influences. I really hear a lot of Rush and a lot of Fate's Warning, a bit of Queensryche in there. The songwriting is having trouble kind of trying to combine all these various influences. They don't sound unique yet, which is pretty typical for most bands on their first album. I mean, it takes a few albums to really find your own sound, and especially with a band like Dream Theater, where it's obvious that they love so many different styles of music, it's going to take a while for them to kind of like mesh all of those together into a sound that is unique to them while still paying homage to their different influences that they love. But with this first album, it's just kind of stale. It's a little boring. It's a nice curiosity, and if you're a big Dream Theater fan, I'm sure you can go back and just kind of listen to it for fun. But this would probably be the last album I would recommend to someone if they asked me to, hey, if someone asked me, hey, what's a Dream Theater album I should listen to kind of get an idea of what they are and to get into them, When Dream and Day Unite would probably be one of the last albums I would suggest. But with all that being said, probably the first album that I would suggest, or at least one of the first albums, would be their second album, Images and Words from 1991. The first album with James LaBrie on vocals, and the first album where you kind of start getting a taste of what Dream Theater is going to be. Songs like Learning to Live, Under a Glass Moon, Metropolis Part 1, Pull Me Under, these big epic songs, and you kind of get a taste like, oh, this is what Dream Theater is going to be. And I'm going to put it in A tier, which I apologize. I may have just pissed off a bunch of Dream Theater fans with that. For a long time, this would have been an S tier for me, but since I'm doing this ranking video and I'm trying to hold my feet to the fire, like I said, and not just put every Dream Theater album that I love up in S tier, I'm going to put it in A, only for a couple minor things, and that is, although this is a great album, and although it does sound a lot more like Dream Theater, it does also still sound a little bit like Queensryche at times, and it still kind of feels like they haven't fully formed their own sound yet. That combined with the fact that I'm not really the biggest fan of songs like Surrounded and Another Day. They're fine, but when you compare them to songs like Under a Glass Moon, Wait for Sleep, Learning to Live, or even like Take the Time, they really are not as good as those songs in my opinion. This is kind of one of the albums I was talking about where most of the songs are amazing, but there's just one or two that aren't bad, but just aren't as good as the others. It's not the biggest offender in my opinion. There's a couple other albums I'll talk about with that. But overall, it's a great album. It's incredible. I understand why it's the favorite Dream Theater album for a lot of people. I just think that it's going to be an A tier because the seeds of where Dream Theater were going were all there, but they hadn't quite developed it yet into a full album. You know, when you think about albums that would come down the line, they take inspiration from this, but they push it more into their own sound. So if all that rambling makes sense, that's why this is an A tier instead of S. Images and Words, it's an amazing album. If you're trying to get into Dream Theater, it's one of the first albums I'd say to go check out. But there's ones I like better. Okay, and the next album is 1994's Awake. Now, before I rank this album, I just want to say, if we were just going off of how much I respect this album, it would be up in S tier. Yeah, but we're going off of more of how much I like listening to this album. And it would have been so easy for Dream Theater to just make Images and Words Part 2 and to just stay with the same style and to just kind of try to repeat the same success they had with that album, which is honestly what a lot of bands do. They find a formula and they stick with it. But Dream Theater decided to incorporate different influences, to keep expanding their sound, to try to experiment with different genres. This is the first album with the song The Mirror that has a 7-string guitar on it, and it's really noticeable. It's cool that they're pushing themselves and listening to what's going on around them. I also love Mike Portnoy's drum intro for 6 O'Clock. Space Dyed Vest is incredible. This album is good, but I'm going to put it down in B tier because I feel like if you combine Images and Words and Awake, you kind of get what you'll have on later Dream Theater albums that I like better. And with this one, although like I said, I respect it for them experimenting and for not just resting on their foundation and trying to do Images and Words Part 2. When this album came out, they still hadn't quite found out how to mesh their love of all these different genres into a cohesive sounding unit. It's fun and they can tell that they're experimenting and they like it, but the songs just feel a bit I don't want to say stale, but a bit unrefined. The songwriting is not really finding a way how to make everything sound like it fits together yet. Um, and so for that, I'm going to put it in B tier. My appreciation for this album has still grown a lot over the years. When I first heard it, it probably would have been down like C or C minus. So maybe it will go up to S tier. I do think this is an album that you can really meditate on and kind of learn to love even more the more you listen to it. But I do think it was a bit of a step back from Images and Words, and I don't think it's as good as a lot of the albums that came after it. Still pretty solid, though. An album that I don't think is that solid, and the next album we're going to be talking about is Falling Into Infinity from 1997. And I don't want to rag on this album too hard, but I am going to put it at the bottom for now, because this album just feels kind of uninspired. I don't even mind that it's not as heavy as the albums that came before it. It just sounds so stale. And I like certain parts of this album. I like the intro to New Millennium. There's, like with all these albums, there's insane musicianship on it. It just feels uninspired. I know Kevin Moore left Dream Theater after Awake. They had Derek Sherinian, so I feel like they were in a place where they didn't know exactly what they wanted to do, and it kind of shows on the songwriting. They're still trying to find a way to balance all their different musical genres that they love, and they're also trying to appeal more commercial. So it's just, yeah, this album's kind of a mess. I don't, like I said, if it is your favorite Dream Theater album, I mean, by all means, go ahead and enjoy it. I don't think it's like a horrible, disgraceful album by any means. I'm gonna put it down below When Dream and Day Unite, because even though When Dream and Day Unite sounds very much in the shadow of its influences, it at least sounds like it has a lot of passion behind it, where with Falling Into Infinity, it doesn't really seem like there's much passion there. Like I said, it just sounds stale, it sounds uninspired, and it sounds like the band is really trying to find a sound that they can work with. So yeah, Falling Into Infinity, my least favorite Dream Theater album. I don't think I'm gonna really like shock anyone with that. I feel like that might be a consensus. But if you disagree, if you love this album, please, like I said, let me know in the comments. Let's talk about it. And yeah, coming up next though is an album that is gonna be the first S tier for me. I don't even think I have to say much about it. Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory, might be my all-time favorite Dream Theater album. And there's a couple more that are going to be up in S tier, but this is the first album I feel like where Dream Theater was able to combine all their different influences, all the different sounds they were doing on Images and Words, Awake, even Falling Into Infinity and When Dream and Day Unite, and they combined it into something that sounds absolutely unique to them. Images and Words had hints of this, and they kind of drifted away with these albums, and they took what they did with Awake and Falling Into Infinity, but then they kind of repackaged it into Images and Words, and the result is Metropolis Part 2, which from beginning to end I think is just absolutely incredible. The way each song flows into each other. If you start off listening to Regression, you gotta listen to the whole album. You can't just cut halfway through. You can't stop after Through Her Eyes. You have to stay up until the very end, until finally Freak. I don't think that having Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory, up in S tier should be controversial to anyone. It is really one of their best albums, and it still holds up, 24 years after it was released. And I think it is the first album in a string of albums where Dream Theater really found their sound, and they just released banger album after banger album after banger album. And we're going to start talking about that right now. And so right after Metropolis Part 2, they released 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. And like I said, I think starting with Metropolis Part 2, Dream Theater just released banger after banger album. This one is probably the least favorite out of the albums they did. So I'm going to put, in that period, so I'm going to put it ahead of Awake in B tier. I still think it's an amazing album, and just like Awake, I respect it a lot because 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence might be Dream Theater's most musically challenging and complex and dense album. It's an album that, even by the standards of progressive rock and progressive metal, you really have to take your time to absorb because there is so much going on in it. There's so many layers. The songwriting is super complicated. I feel like they were trying to push themselves to the extreme. I mean, they have a 42-minute long song on the second half of the album. So, like I said, I respect it a lot, and I think it is great. But for me, I just don't love it as much as maybe like Images and Words or Metropolis Part 2 because it's dense, it's very long, and although I do love that, even by my standards, it's like I need more time to absorb it. And the more I listen to it, the more I do like it. So, if I was doing this a year in the future, maybe it would be up in A or S tier. And I absolutely get, just like with Awake, why people love this album so much. But it just holds back a little bit for me. I just hold back a bit on it because it's not as accessible as some of their other albums. And while I respect it a lot, I just don't love it as much as I wish I did. So, B tier for me. Okay, and coming up next, Train of Thought from 2003. And I'm just going to put this up in S tier, right next to Metropolis Part 2. This is one of the few Dream Theater albums that I think every single song on it is just an absolute banger. I also really love that with Metropolis Part 2 and 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, they really push the progressive rock and the experimentation on those albums while still being able to have them fit into a cohesive sound. With Train of Thought, I kind of appreciate that they just said, no, we're going to just go all out metal on this. A lot of people compare it to their Black Album, what the Black Album is to Metallica. And I just think every single song here kicks ass. And the fact that they are writing songs that from a structural standpoint are more simple means that they can experiment with technicality, and every single guy on this album is just pushing themselves to the extreme. Songs like This Dying Soul, As I Am, In the Name of God, you can tell that the keyboard solos, the guitar solos, the drum intros, they were just thinking to themselves, how can we push ourselves to our absolute limit in terms of our technical ability? And it sounds really good. Not to mention the riffs are incredible. The intro to As I Am is incredibly heavy. Stream of Consciousness is maybe their best instrumental song, and I really love how they keep the tradition of having a soft acoustic or soft piano song that leads into a grander epic with Vacant leading into Stream of Consciousness. Endless Sacrifice is another great song, Honor Thy Father. It's just banger after banger after banger, and you still have hints of their progressive tendencies. I mean, these are not simple songs. The majority of them are, 10 minutes long or more, but they just are metal songs first with progressive elements instead of being prog rock songs with hints of metal. And it's just so heavy, so aggressive, just so good. I really love Train of Thought, and I think it is easily one of their best albums. Not their most diverse album, but just solid from beginning to end, and I love this album. So their Train of Thought is up in S tier right next to Metropolis Part 2. I'll give Metropolis Part 2 the edge because I do love the progressive elements in it, but Train of Thought, it's neck and neck between those two albums. Okay, so coming up next is another absolute banger of an album, Octavarium. I'm going to put it up in A tier, and honestly, yeah, I'm going to put it ahead of Images and Words because I think Images and Words is a more this is difficult. Okay, so I think Images and Words is kind of more solid from beginning to end, but the highs in Octavarium are so good that, yeah, I am going to put it above Images and Words. The Root of All Evil, These Walls, and the title track Octavarium, along with Sacrifice Sons, are all incredible. Once again, Dream Theater just ends with this really big, epic song that I love. I feel like they were able to find a healthy medium between albums like 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence and Metropolis and Train of Thought with this album. You have heavy songs like The Root of All Evil, Sacrifice Sons, Never Enough, And then you also have more progressive songs like Octavarium, and even Sacrifice Sun still has a lot of progginess to it. Panic Attack is another one of my all-time favorite Dream Theater songs that probably could have been on Train of Thought. It kind of feels in that same vein, but I love that they have it on this album. The only reason that I have Octavarium down in A tier and not S tier is because, like I said at the start of this video, there's a lot of Dream Theater albums that have a bunch of amazing songs on them, some of their best stuff. And then there's a couple songs on the album that are not so good. I'm not the biggest fan of I Walk Beside You. It's okay. And then The Answer Lies Within. I can't even listen to it. It really annoys me. It's kind of an example of, in my opinion, the worst parts of Dream Theater, where they get kind of preachy and they get sort of, a little self-righteous with the lyrics. There's a bit of that with I Walk Beside You too, but the music for that one kind of makes up for it a bit. So, yeah, because of those, a little bit lower than these two. But Octavarium is still one of my favorite Dream Theater albums, and I think that if you're trying to get into them, go listen to the song Octavarium, listen to The Root of All Evil, listen to Panic Attack, listen to Sacrifice Sons. That will give you a really good taste of like why Dream Theater is such a beloved band and why they are so good. Okay, and so the next album we're going to be talking about is Systematic Chaos, which has possibly my all-time favorite Dream Theater song, Within the Presence of Enemies. I love Dark Eternal Night. I think Constant Motion is great. This album is all around pretty solid. I'm going to put it at the top of A tier, though. I'm not going to quite put it up here with Train of Thought and Metropolis Part 2. Even though I love most of the songs on this album, and In the Presence of Enemies is most likely my favorite Dream Theater song, I'm going to have it down in A tier, though, because like with a lot of these other albums, there's a few songs on Systematic Chaos that I'm not the biggest fan of. And even though I think most of the songs are absolute bangers, and some of them are even among my favorite Dream Theater songs, Prophets of War and Repentance, I think, are pretty bad. Repentance is okay, but I feel as though it goes on for way too long and doesn't have enough variation to keep it interesting. Prophets of War is just kind of... yeah. Prophets of War, I feel like, wants to be this big, epic anti-war song, but the lyrics are too vague to mean that it actually has an impact. So that, combined with the music not being my favorite thing on that, brings Systematic Chaos down. Even though I love Forsaken, Constant Motion, In the Presence of Enemies, maybe my all-time favorite song by them. It's just those two songs kind of bring it down as a whole for me. So that's that. Okay, so the next album coming up is Black Clouds and Silver Linings, the last Dream Theater album with Mike Portnoy on drums. The first Dream Theater album I ever listened to. And I want to put it up in S tier. Maybe top of it. No, okay, I'm putting in S tier for now. Black Clouds and Silver Linings is an incredible album, and I think it's one of the few albums that every single song is great. Even my least favorite song from this album, Wither, is still really good. And The Count of Tuscany is another one of Dream Theater's songs that is one of their best. The Best of Times is amazing. A Nightmare to Remember is really good. And even the shorter songs like The Shattered Fortress and A Rite of Passage are all really good. Wither is my least favorite song in this album, and it's still a really solid song. I'm going to keep it up on S tier. And that might be sentiment. There might be some sentimental value because this was the first Dream Theater album that I ever listened to. But even still, I think that it is more solid from beginning to end than some of these other albums are. Even though it does have a bit less experimentation, kind of like Train of Thought, it's still just solid from beginning to end. So I think it's a great place to start if you're trying to get into Dream Theater. And yeah, like I said, it might be a bit of sentiment, but I will keep Black Clouds and Silver Linings up in S tier. Coming up next, the first album without Mike Portnoy on drums, the first one with Mike Mangini, from 2011, A Dramatic Turn of Events. I'm gonna put this up in S tier too. The only song on this album that I'm not a big fan of, that I kind of really don't like, is "This Is the Life." Other than that, I think every single one of the songs on this album is incredible. Far From Heaven going into Breaking All Illusions is one of my all-time favorite Dream Theater moments. On the Backs of Angels is a great way to kick off the album. And just like with these albums here too, there's a real cohesive sound to this album. It sounds like it flows from beginning to end. And there's not as much experimentation like is on Awake and 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, but it just sounds like they really clamped down on a style that works for them. I love Outcry, and this was the second Dream Theater album that I really got into, being that Black Clouds and Silver Lining was the first, and this was the one that just came out like a year or two after. So there may be some sentimental value going on there, but I've listened to it since then, and songs like Lost Not Forgotten still hold up really well. I was just listening to that the other day, and yeah, I think that they came out swinging. I feel like maybe they felt like maybe they had something to prove after Mike Portnoy left, and they had some new life injected into the band with Mike Mangini, and so they just made a real banger of an album. And yeah, that's it. I think A Dramatic Turn of Events is up in S tier for me. Unfortunately, I don't think they really kept that initiative and that drive and that swing they were going on with Dramatic Turn of Events for long. Their self-titled 2013 album, I'm just going to put in C tier. It's not bad. I love Illumination Theory, and I can listen to this album and, like Enigma Machine and a lot of the stuff that's on it, but the hints of kind of the things that I maybe didn't like as much on A Dramatic Turn of Events, I feel like get amplified a bit with their 2013 release. The production kind of gets to a point where it feels too sterile, a bit too clean, and it doesn't feel like this album breaks any new ground for them. It does feel like, like I said with Metropolis Part 2, I feel like they finally found their sound, and from Metropolis Part 2 up into A Dramatic Turn of Events, I feel like they were just kind of exploring that sound while still sounding fresh and new and feeling like they were all really into it. Where with this album, it's kind of the first Dream Theater album that I feel like they kind of were maybe resting on their laurels. They were kind of a little uninspired, which, to be fair, I mean, yeah, like as a musician, I get it. Like, you're just releasing all these albums that are all great with 15-minute long songs on most of them, 20-minute long songs, a 42-minute long song here. Like, it can be hard to find the inspiration again. You get burned out. Maybe you're feeling like, well, let's just put this out there. So I don't think that the 2013 album is horrible by any means. I just feel like it's not quite as gripping, and it doesn't have quite the emotional impact for me that a lot of these other albums do. So it's just kind of, I don't want to say Dream Theater by the numbers. That's a bit harsh, but it's kind of like that. So 2013 album, I might change my opinion in the future if I, listen to it more, but I've listened to a lot, and I just kind of feel like, yeah, it's okay, it's fine. But, still, like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm not trying to rag on any of these albums too hard. So, yeah, I just think this is like right in the middle, just basic Dream Theater with some pretty high points, but overall just kind of okay. And so the next album that we're going to talk about it's the reason why I have a C- on this instead of a D or an F. And that's the Astonishing from 2016. I'm just going to put it right here in C-. Oh, this album, man. I have such extreme opinions and extreme feelings on this album on both ends of the spectrum, because on the one hand, I think that to release a double album that's a concept album and to create all these characters and to have something this ambitious is really cool, and I really respect that. So like Awake and 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, if we're talking about how much I respect the fact that they were trying something new and that they were just making a massive swing and really trying to break new ground, I'd put it up in S tier. However, even though, once again, like, songs on this album that I love, Dystopian Overture, the musicianship is insane, but talking about the concept album aspect of it, I feel like all I have to say is that the bad guy on this album is named Lord Nefarious, but it's like spelled like Narfy. Like, you literally named your bad guy Lord Nefarious. I mean, come on, dude. How am I supposed to take that seriously? Like I can tell a lot of passion went into this album, and so, like I said, all that stuff there, it's great. And there's moments on this album that I absolutely love. The intro to A Life Left Behind is one of my favorite Dream Theater intros. I love the acoustic guitar there. Dystopian Overture is incredible. The riffs are super heavy. Even moments like Moment of Betrayal, no pun intended, but songs like Moment of Betrayal, there's a lot of stuff that you can like here. I also think that John Petrucci has some of his most thoughtful solos on this album. He really was finding a great balance between his shreddiness and just tasteful, kind of more David Gilmour inspired playing. So there's a lot that I love about this album, but yeah, the cheesiness I just can't get over. You know, you have one of your main characters named Faith, and like, you're losing faith. I just, come on. Like, I'm sorry. I can't get over that. So, you know, honestly, in some ways, this is my least favorite Dream Theater album, and in some ways, I really respect it. So I'll just put it in C-. It's a swing and a miss, which, if I'm being perfectly honest, I would rather a band take a massive chance and it doesn't really pan out than kind of just stay, stagnant. So I guess by that logic, it should be above the 2013 album, because at least they were trying something new. But if you're going to try something new, please don't name the bad guy of your album Lord Nefarious. That's a little bit on the nose, don't you think? So if someone loves this album, then by all means go ahead, get into it. I don't hate it, but yeah, I would rather listen to all of these albums before I listen to The Astonishing. But I'd rather listen to The Astonishing than these two albums, so there you go. Okay, and so the next album, 2019's Distance Over Time. I'll put it in B tier. I like it a bit better than the 2013 self-titled, but I don't think it reaches the heights of these other albums. It is cool to see that. I feel like after The Astonishing and doing a double album and having this big grand conceptual album, Dream Theater just kind of did a more by the numbers album, but they feel like they're a bit more inspired than they were in their 2013 self-titled. I really love songs like Pale Blue Dot and Barstool Warrior. Lyrically, I think it's a bit better than The Astonishing, but there are sometimes on that album where the lyrics are a bit kind of what I call falling down, hurt myself lyrics, which is a reference to an episode of Metalocalypse where Nathan Explosion is in the vocal booth and he can't come up with anything, so he's just kind of going, falling down, hurt myself real bad. Oh, broke my arm falling down the stairs. That's I feel like some of the lyrics are kind of like that, where it's just sort of stock metal lyrics that aren't really saying too much, but they're not so egregious as to, have the bad guy of their story be called Lord Nefarious. So a little bit more inspiration, a little bit more fun than the 2013 album. Not as good as any of these albums, I think, but it is an album that does sound kind of even throughout. I don't think it has super high moments or super low moments. It just sort of is good throughout, from beginning to end. So there's that. And coming up to their last album, A View from the Top of the World, A View from the Top of the World, um, this might be maybe like my most controversial opinion, and I don't know if it's just because it's their newest album, but I'm putting this up in S tier. I think this album is an absolute banger from beginning to end. It's one of the few Dream Theater albums that there's nothing on it that I feel like is kind of dead weight. And I feel like it's much more inspired than Distance Over Time or the 2013 release. It feels like they're having a bit more fun with this album. And all the songs from Awaken the Master, the first Dream Theater song with an 8-string, to the title track, to The Alien, there is just an energy to this album, and I've listened to it a lot, so maybe that has something to do with it. But yeah, for my money, this is just one of their best albums and a great way to get introduced to them if you're trying to get into Dream Theater. Is it as good as... Okay, so for me, I don't know. I might put it above... A Dramatic Turn of Events. And honestly, I might put it above Black Clouds and Silver Lining, but I don't know if it's just because it's newer to me. Huh. I don't know. Yeah, you know what? For right now, being that this is just a casual video on YouTube, yeah, I will commit to that for this video. I will say that A View from the Top of the World is an album that I like better than Black Clouds and Silver Linings, and even an album that I like better than A Dramatic Turn of Events, but not one I like as much as Train of Thought or Metropolis Part 2. That might change. It might be down here again, but, you know, if I listen to those. But for right now, that's where I'm going to put it. I think it's an incredible album. So there you go. That is the tier list from me for every single Dream Theater album. And my God, what a legacy. Like, when you look at these albums up here, just absolutely incredible. And the majority of these albums are all really good, just pushing the boundaries of what you can do technically as a musician and what you can record. There's so much talent on every single one of these, even these. And yeah, I mean, this was fun to talk about one of my favorite bands and talk about their albums a bit. So, you know, if you disagree or even if you do agree, let me know what you think of this list in the comments below. What are your favorite Dream Theater albums? What are your favorite Dream Theater songs? Do you agree with me when I say that Dream Theater has a tendency to have 5 or 6 absolute bangers on an album and then 2 or 3 songs that are kind of duds? Or do you disagree with that? This is all just kind of for dumb fun, so if you disagree, that's fine. You know, let's just have the comments so we can talk about one of our favorite progressive metal bands. And yeah, what a legacy. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and you know, let us know in the comments what you think about Dream Theater and these albums. What are your favorite albums? And thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you at the next video. Peace.